In the quiet back rooms of museums, far from the bright lights and carefully curated exhibits, there are objects that almost no one stops to look at. They are not made of gold. They do not tower like statues of gods or kings. They are not sealed in glass cases with dramatic lighting. They are small, dull, often broken pieces of dried clay, stacked in drawers, labeled with inventory numbers that mean nothing to the average visitor. And yet, these unassuming objects may contain the oldest recorded thoughts humanity has ever left behind. More than 500,000 clay tablets covered in cuneiform writing are scattered across museums, universities, and private collections around the world. 500,000, that number alone should feel unsettling. Not because the tablets exist, but because most of them have never truly been read. They are not undeciphered in the sense that the symbols are completely unknown. Scholars understand how cuneiform works. They know how the wedge-shaped marks were pressed into soft clay thousands of years ago. But understanding a system and unlocking its full content are two very different things. These tablets are not rare curiosities. They are the paperwork of the first civilizations. They record debts, contracts, crop yields, prayers, legal rulings, royal commands, and myths. They document how societies actually functioned day to day, and because of that, they preserve something far more dangerous than legends. They preserve patterns, decisions, assumptions about how the world works. Assumptions that may not match the story we tell ourselves today. For nearly 5,000 years, these tablets have existed in a kind of historical limbo. They are acknowledged, catalogued, photographed, and archived, yet largely silent. Not because they have nothing to say, but because listening to them has always been painfully slow. Cuneiform is not a single language. It is a writing system used by many cultures across millennia. Sumerians used it first, but Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Hittites, and Persians all adopted it, reshaped it, and bent it to fit their own languages. That means one symbol can carry different meanings depending on who wrote it, when it was written, and in what context it appears. A single mark might represent a sound in one text, a full word in another, or an abstract idea somewhere else entirely. There is no universal key, no single reference stone waiting to solve everything at once. Every tablet is its own puzzle, and many of them are damaged, eroded, or incomplete. Time has not been kind to clay. For centuries, progress depended on a very small number of A scholar might dedicate decades of their life to mastering one ancient language, only to translate a few dozen tablets by hand. Each translation is an interpretation. Each interpretation invites debate. Even today, experts regularly disagree about the meaning of the same line of text. Multiply that level of uncertainty by hundreds of thousands of tablets, and it becomes clear why so much remains untouched. So the largest body of untranslated text in human history continues to sit in storage, waiting. And here is where the story begins to feel uncomfortably modern. We live in an age where machines digest information faster than humans ever could. Algorithms recognize faces, predict behavior, and translate living languages in real time. We casually rely on systems that analyze more data in seconds than a human could process in a lifetime. Yet until very recently, we never seriously considered pointing that power backward in time. What happens when artificial intelligence meets ancient writing? What happens when something that does not get tired, does not forget patterns, and does not need to spend 20 years learning a dead language, begins to look at cuneiform, not as a sacred artifact, but as data? The idea feels almost disrespectful at first. After all, these tablets are the foundation of civilization. They represent the birth of writing itself. But writing, stripped of its mystique, is exactly what machines excel at analyzing: patterns, structures, repetition, probability, context, the very things that make cuneiform difficult for humans make it strangely suitable for machine learning. And that possibility changes everything, because these tablets do not merely describe ancient life, they describe ancient understanding. They reveal how early civilizations explained their origins. They justified their authority and made sense of their place in the world. They show what people believed about gods, kings, nature, and themselves. If even a small fraction of these texts challenge modern assumptions, then the silence surrounding them suddenly feels less like an accident and more like a vulnerability. We are used to thinking of history as something already settled, the timeline neatly laid out, with footnotes and textbooks telling us where we came from. But that confidence rests on a surprisingly small sample of evidence. A few translated texts, a few surviving monuments, a few interpretations that hardened into consensus simply because there was nothing else to compare them to. 500,000 unread tablets change that equation. They suggest that the version of history we know may be incomplete, not by a few missing details, but by entire chapters. And the longer they remain unread, the easier it is to pretend those chapters do not matter. So the real question is not whether these tablets are important. The real question is why we have been so comfortable leaving them unread for so long, and what it might mean now that we finally have the tools to listen. If the story they tell does not place us at the beginning after all. Because once the clay starts speaking, it may not say what we expect. It may not confirm our myths. It may not protect our assumptions. And it may quietly suggest that the story of humanity did not start where we were taught it did. If those tablets are the sleeping memory of civilization, then the place where they were written was its first operating system. Long before empires, before scriptures, before philosophy tried to explain existence, something very practical happened in a stretch of land between two rivers. The Tigris, the Euphrates, a region we now call Mesopotamia, but which once functioned less like a cradle and more like a test environment. This was not a place chosen for beauty or symbolism. It was chosen because it worked. Seasonal floods deposited fertile silt, crops could be grown reliably, surplus appeared. And surplus, as it turns out, is where complexity begins. When you have more grain than you need today, you suddenly have a problem your ancestors never faced. How to remember who owns what tomorrow. That problem gave birth to writing. Cuneiform did not emerge as poetry or myth. It emerged as accounting. The earliest tablets are not songs to the gods or reflections on creation. They are lists, tallies, inventories, so many jars of barley, so many sheep delivered, so many workers assigned. Civilization did not begin with inspiration. It began with administration. And this is where things get interesting. Because once you invent a system to record economic reality, you inevitably begin to record social reality. Who has authority? Who gives orders? Who receives punishment? Who speaks for the gods? Writing turns memory into infrastructure. It freezes decisions in time. It allows power to persist beyond the lifespan of any single human being. In that sense, cuneiform was the first technology that truly outlived its creators. Over time, those wedge-shaped marks expanded beyond bookkeeping. They began to record prayers, hymns, royal proclamations, laws, omens, medical recipes, astronomical observations, and stories about the distant past. Not history as we define it today, but memory shaped into narrative. Memory with intent. And here's the crucial detail we often gloss over. Cuneiform was not owned by one culture. The Sumerians pioneered it, but they did not control it for long. Akkadians adopted it, Babylonians refined it, Assyrians weaponized it. Each culture inherited the same basic writing system and then modified it to fit entirely different spoken languages. It is the ancient equivalent of everyone using the same social media platform, but speaking completely different tongues. Imagine opening an old hard drive and finding posts written in English, Spanish, Latin, and several languages no one speaks anymore. All using the same alphabet, all mixed together, all missing punctuation, and half of them corrupted by time. That is what scholars face when they confront cuneiform. And unlike modern writing, these texts offer no helpful signposts, no vowels, no standardized spelling, no consistent grammar. A single symbol might mean king in one era, god in another, and something entirely mundane in a third. Context is everything. Lose the context, and meaning collapses. This is why translating cuneiform has always been more art than algorithm. A scholar does not simply decode symbols. They reconstruct a worldview. They must know which god was popular in which century, which political rivalries were active, which metaphors were fashionable, and which scribal conventions were in use at the time. One wrong assumption can shift the entire meaning of a passage. So progress has been slow, painfully slow. For generations, only a handful of specialists worldwide were capable of reading even one branch of cuneiform fluently. Akkadian alone takes years to master. Sumerian behaves nothing like modern languages. And beyond those, there are dozens of dialects and regional variants layered on top of each other like sedimentary rock. This bottleneck shaped our understanding of ancient history more than we like to admit. Because when only a few people can read the past they reveal is inevitably selective. Not by conspiracy, but by capacity. Scholars translated what they could, not what was statistically representative. Entire categories of texts were ignored simply because they were repetitive, damaged, or boring. And boring texts, as it turns out, are often the most honest. A myth can exaggerate, a royal inscription can lie, but a warehouse receipt rarely has a reason to deceive. When you read enough administrative records, patterns emerge that no epic poem would ever admit. Patterns about population size, labor organization, resource control. Patterns that quietly contradict the grand narratives carved into monuments. Which brings us back to the scale of what remains unread. Hundreds of thousands of tablets are not waiting to confirm what we already know. They are waiting to overwhelm it. Statistically, the version of ancient history we tell today is built on a fraction of the available data. A highlight reel, not the full archive. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the reason ancient civilizations sometimes appear to emerge suddenly, fully formed, with advanced systems of law, astronomy, and engineering, is not because they developed overnight, but because we are missing the slow build-up recorded on tablets no one has read yet. Or worse, what if those tablets describe influences, teachers, or precedents that do not fit neatly into the story of human self-invention? Because when a civilization records its own origins, it is rarely modest. The Sumerians did not say they figured everything out on their own. They claimed their knowledge was given, taught, delivered by beings who already knew how things worked. For a long time, that was dismissed as mythology. Gods explaining agriculture, gods explaining kingship, gods explaining civilization itself. But mythology, when recorded in administrative systems, becomes harder to ignore, especially when it is repeated consistently across cultures that share a writing system but not a religion. So cuneiform is not just the foundation of writing. It is the foundation of a shared technological memory, one that multiple civilizations use to record their understanding of where they came from and who helped them get there. And the more of it we read, the more that memory begins to look less like fiction and more like testimony. There is a comforting idea that somewhere in history, there exists a master key, a single discovery that suddenly makes everything readable. A Rosetta Stone moment where confusion collapses into clarity and the past finally explains itself. For Egyptian hieroglyphs, that fantasy came true. For cuneiform, it never did. And that absence matters more than it seems. Cuneiform is not a code in the way people imagine codes. It is not a locked door waiting for the right password. It is closer to a crowded city built over thousands of years, where streets were renamed, buildings repurposed, and entire neighborhoods abandoned, only to be built over again. The same symbol might pass through generations, cultures, and languages, quietly changing its meaning along the way. One wedge pressed into clay could stand for a sound, or a word, or an idea. Sometimes all three at once. The meaning depends on who wrote it, when they wrote it, and why they wrote it. A tablet recording grain deliveries uses the same symbols as a tablet describing the creation of the world. Context is not helpful here. Context is everything, and context is fragile. Many tablets are broken. Corners are missing. Lines trail off into cracks where time erased the rest. Some tablets were baked accidentally in ancient fires, preserving them perfectly. Others remain sun-dried and vulnerable, slowly eroding as centuries passed. Even when a tablet survives intact, it rarely explains itself. There are no footnotes, no introductions, no explanations for future readers who might stumble across it 5,000 years later, so scholars do what humans have always done when faced with incomplete information. They infer, they compare, they argue. One expert reads a line as a religious invocation, another reads the same line as a political slogan, a third sees an economic transaction hidden behind symbolic language. None of them are necessarily wrong, and that is precisely the problem. Meaning fractures into possibilities, and certainty becomes elusive. This ambiguity is multiplied by scale. Cuneiform was used for more than 3,000 years. That is longer than the time separating us from the Roman Empire. Languages rose and fell, empires collapsed, gods changed names, yet the same writing system persisted, quietly absorbing all of it. Imagine reading English texts written continuously from the Bronze Age to today, without punctuation, vowels, or standardized spelling. Imagine that bank might mean a riverbank in one century, a financial institution in another, and a divine concept in a third. Now imagine that half the pages are missing. That is the task, and for a long time, this difficulty acted as a natural barrier. It limited how much could be known, how fast it could be known, and who could know it. Cuneiform scholarship became a narrow funnel. Knowledge passed through a small number of minds, each constrained by time, funding, and human endurance, which meant something subtle but important happened. Our understanding of ancient history was shaped not by what was most representative, but by what was most survivable for human attention. Epic myths were translated because they were interesting. Royal inscriptions were translated because they were prestigious. Legal codes were translated because they felt foundational. But repetitive texts, economic records, routine correspondence, they piled up, unread, because no one had a lifetime long enough to spare. Yet those ignored texts may be the most revealing of all. Patterns of trade reveal who depended on whom. Labor records reveal population sizes and social hierarchies. Standardized measurements reveal levels of technological coordination that myths never mention. And taken together, thousands of mundane tablets can tell a story far more honest than a single heroic narrative carved into stone. This is why the absence of a Rosetta Stone matters. It ensured that the past remained fragmented. It kept certainty out of reach. It forced historians to build sweeping conclusions on narrow foundations. And it quietly trained us to accept that uncertainty is permanent. Until now, because ambiguity is not a weakness for machines. It is fuel. Where a human sees confusion, an algorithm sees probability. where a scholar debates two possible meanings. A neural network maps thousands of contextual relationships and asks which interpretation fits best across the entire dataset. It does not need a master key. It builds one dynamically based on patterns no human could hold in their head at once. And suddenly, the thing that made cuneiform unreadable becomes the thing that makes it readable. A machine does not get tired after the 50th tablet. It does not lose patience halfway through a repetitive inventory list. It does not privilege myth over accounting because one is more interesting than the other. It treats all of it as data, equal, comparable, scalable. That shift changes the question from can we translate this to what happens when we translate all of it. Because once translation is no longer limited by human scarcity, the past stops being curated. It becomes statistical. And statistics have a way of exposing uncomfortable truths. They reveal outliers. They reveal consistencies. They reveal stories that no single tablet could ever tell on its own. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they reveal when a culture says the same thing again and again, across centuries, across cities, across languages. When different civilizations, using the same writing system, but worshipping different gods, keep repeating the same origin stories, the same claims about who taught them, the same assumptions about who came before, it becomes harder to dismiss those patterns as coincidence. Without a Rosetta Stone, we learn to live with uncertainty. With artificial intelligence, uncertainty becomes something we can finally measure. And once we can measure it, we may discover that the past has been trying to tell us the same story all along. The turning point did not arrive with a dramatic announcement or a sudden revelation carved into stone. It began quietly, the way most paradigm shifts do, inside a university lab. As part of a graduate research project that did not set out to rewrite history, it set out to solve a problem, a very old problem. How do you translate a language that no one speaks anymore? Written in a system that was never designed to be consistent. At Tel Aviv University, a small research team began asking a question that would have sounded almost irresponsible a decade earlier. What if ancient cuneiform could be treated the same way modern languages are treated by machine translation systems? Not as sacred texts requiring human intuition at every step, but as structured data governed by patterns, probabilities, and context. At first glance, the idea seemed doomed. Akkadian, one of the most common languages written in cuneiform, shares almost nothing with English. The syntax is different, the word order is different, the grammatical logic is different. Even the way meaning is layered into sentences follows rules that feel alien to modern readers. For decades, scholars assumed that machines could help with transcription at best, but never with real translation. And to be fair, early attempts failed. Word-for-word translation produced nonsense. Mechanical substitutions stripped sentences of meaning and tone. The results were accurate in the most useless way possible. Technically correct, functionally unreadable. It became clear that if machines were ever going to understand cuneiform, they would need to do what human translators actually do, but at a scale humans cannot manage. They would need to learn relationships. Modern neural-machine translation does not translate individual words. It learns how ideas travel together. It learns which concepts tend to appear in which contexts. It builds a statistical sense of meaning by being exposed to massive amounts of parallel text. This is why tools like Google Translate feel surprisingly human. They are not recalling dictionaries. They are predicting intent. The Tel Aviv team applied that same logic to Akkadian. Instead of forcing the system to jump directly from cuneiform to English, they trained it to recognize patterns in previously translated texts. Thousands of human-translated Akkadian passages were fed into the model. The system learned how certain structures behave, how verbs shift meaning depending on context, how royal inscriptions differ linguistically from prayers, how economic texts sound nothing like myths. In 2020, the team reached their first major milestone. They demonstrated that AI could convert Akkadian cuneiform into Latin transliteration with approximately 97% accuracy. That alone was a breakthrough. Transliteration is the most time-consuming and technical stage of cuneiform study. Automating it removed a massive bottleneck. But transliteration is not translation. It is like converting handwriting into typed text without understanding what the text means. The real challenge still lay ahead. Translating Akkadian into English required the system to do something far more difficult. It had to decide how to construct meaning across two languages that evolved in completely different cognitive environments. Latin-based languages lean heavily on word order. Akkadian relies on inflection and context. What makes sense in one can sound backward or fragmented in the other. This is where the system began to behave in ways that surprised even its creators. Rather than matching symbols mechanically, the AI started assembling sentences based on likelihood. It asked, in effect, given everything I've seen before, what is the most probable meaning of this sequence? Sometimes it was wrong. Sometimes it was ambiguous. But often, it produced translations that matched or closely resembled those created by human experts. And it did so in seconds. What once required years of training and weeks of focused labor could now begin with a few moments of computation. not as a final answer, but as a first pass. A rough translation that scholars could evaluate, correct, and refine. This distinction matters. The AI was not replacing experts. It was amplifying them. For the first time, researchers could scan large collections of tablets quickly. They could identify which texts were mundane and which were unusual, which ones repeated known patterns, and which ones introduced something new. Instead of spending months translating inventory lists, scholars could focus their attention on passages that actually raised questions. And those questions came fast. Because when you suddenly have access to large samples instead of isolated highlights, patterns emerge that were previously invisible. Certain phrases appeared far more often than expected. Certain concepts clustered together across centuries. Certain ideas showed up in administrative texts, not just in myths. Ideas about origin, about authority, about beings who instructed, organized, and ruled. The team published their results in a peer-reviewed journal, carefully emphasizing the limitations of the system. This was not a lost library recovered overnight. It was a tool, a powerful one, but still a beginning. Yet even that cautious framing could not hide the implications. If high-quality machine translation of cuneiform is possible at all, then scale becomes inevitable. Tens of thousands of tablets already scanned and digitized could be processed. Hundreds of thousands could follow. The silence that has surrounded the earliest written civilization for millennia would begin to crack. And once it does, it will not crack selectively. The machine does not know which stories are supposed to be symbolic. It does not care which interpretations are comfortable. It does not privilege modern belief systems over ancient ones. It simply surfaces patterns and hands them to us. Which means that the next phase of this story is no longer about technology. It is about what we do when the past finally starts answering questions we did not know how to ask. The unsettling part is not what remains unread. It is what has already been read. Out of more than 500,000 known cuneiform tablets, only a tiny fraction has been translated with care. Depending on how strictly you define translated, the number hovers somewhere around 1%. And yet, that sliver alone has been enough to destabilize some of humanity's most cherished assumptions about its own beginnings. From this narrow window into the ancient world, entire narratives have already emerged. One of the most famous is the Sumerian king list. At first glance, it looks like exactly what it claims to be. A chronological record of rulers, cities, and reign lengths. But as soon as you read it closely, something feels wrong. The earliest kings are said to have ruled not for decades, but for thousands of years. Tens of thousands. These are not symbolic flourishes tucked into a mythological poem. They appear in an administrative document, formatted like a ledger. For modern readers, the instinct is immediate. Exaggeration, metaphor, myth, creeping into history. But that reaction raises a quieter question. Why would a bureaucratic culture obsessed with measurement, precision, and record-keeping suddenly abandon realism only at the moment it describes its earliest rulers? Why track grain and labor with ruthless accuracy, but invent absurd reign lengths out of thin air? The king list does not present these figures as gods. It presents them as kings, rulers who governed cities, oversaw populations, and then passed authority to successors. Only later do reign lengths shorten, gradually converging on numbers that look recognizably human. Something changes, and that change is not explained. Then there is the flood. Long before the book of Genesis was written, Sumerian and Akkadian tablets described a catastrophic deluge sent by divine forces to reset the world. A chosen survivor, a massive boat, animals preserved, humanity starting again from the wreckage. The parallels are not subtle, they are structural. For centuries this was framed as cultural borrowing in one direction. The Bible, it was said, absorbed older Mesopotamian myths and reinterpreted them through a monotheistic lens. And that may well be true. But that explanation quietly sidesteps something more disturbing. If multiple civilizations recorded the same catastrophe, using the same writing system, across different eras and political regimes, then the question shifts from literary influence to historical memory. At some point, dismissing repetition as coincidence becomes less satisfying than asking why the story was worth preserving so consistently. And then there are the Anunnaki. In modern pop culture, the name has been stretched, sensationalized, and often distorted. But in the tablets themselves, the Anunnaki are not cartoon villains or science fiction aliens. They are described as powerful beings who precede humanity's rise to civilization. They organize the world, they establish laws, they assign roles, they teach. Most importantly, they do not emerge from humanity. Humanity emerges after them. In some texts, humans are created explicitly to work, to serve, to relieve the gods of labor. The language is blunt. There's no attempt to frame this as a moral parable. It reads like a solution to a logistical problem. Again, the modern instinct is to reach for symbolism, to say these are metaphors for social hierarchy or natural forces, and perhaps they are. But symbolism does not require consistency across centuries of administrative, religious, and literary texts. symbols drift. These accounts do not. Across tablets written hundreds of years apart, by scribes serving different rulers and cities, the same core idea repeats. Civilization did not arise spontaneously. It was instructed, and this is where the implications of scale begin to press in. If 1% of the tablets already contain king lists that defy human lifespans, flood narratives that predate scripture, and creation stories involving non-human teachers, what does the remaining 99% hold? More importantly, how often do these themes repeat? Because repetition is evidence, not proof, but evidence. A single myth can be dismissed. A pattern across cultures, preserved in bureaucratic records, becomes harder to ignore, especially when those cultures shared a writing system, but not a religion, not a government, and not even a language. And there are smaller details, easily overlooked, that add weight to the picture. References 2 times before kingship descended from heaven, mentions of cities that existed before recorded dynasties, casual allusions to an earlier order of the world, treated not as legend, but as background knowledge. These are not framed as speculative. They are assumed. What emerges from this narrow slice of translated text is not a clear answer, but a clear tension. The story ancient Mesopotamians told about themselves does not align with the modern narrative of gradual, isolated human development. They did not see themselves as the first to figure things out. They saw themselves as inheritors, students, and perhaps, in some cases, replacements. This does not mean they were right. Ancient people could be wrong about many things, but it does mean they believed something strongly enough to record it repeatedly, across generations, in the most durable medium they had, which brings us back to the uncomfortable math of it all. If 1% is already enough to shake the foundations, then the silence of the remaining 99% begins to feel less like ignorance and more like a delay, a pause before a larger confrontation. Because once translation moves from isolated brilliance to statistical completeness, we will no longer be dealing with stories. We will be dealing with patterns. And patterns do not care whether we are ready for them. At some point, the focus shifts from tablets to text, and from text to interpretation. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because it no longer lives safely in the past. It reaches forward, into belief systems that many people still carry with them today. And nowhere is that tension more visible than in the figure of Adam. The idea that Adam was the first human being is so deeply embedded in cultural memory that it rarely gets questioned. It feels foundational, almost obvious. But when the text itself is examined carefully, that certainty begins to erode. In the opening chapter of Genesis, humanity is created on the 6th day, male and female. Together, they are given instructions to multiply, to fill the earth, to subdue it, and to rule over other living creatures. It is a sweeping statement, broad in scope, and notably impersonal. There are no names, no individual identities, just humans, plural, already placed into a populated world that needs governing. Then the narrative pauses. God rests on the 7th day. Only after that rest does Adam appear. Genesis does not explicitly connect the creation of humans on the 6th day to the creation of Adam. That link is assumed, not stated. Adam is formed later, in a different setting, under different circumstances, with a different purpose. The text treats him not as a continuation, but as a new development. For centuries, this distinction was ignored or smoothed over. There was no practical reason to challenge it. Without archaeology, without genetics, without any way to measure deep time, it made sense to compress everything into a single origin story. Adam became shorthand for humanity itself. But modern knowledge has changed the context. We now know that anatomically modern humans existed long before the time traditionally assigned to Adam. We know that by 10,000 years ago, humans had spread across continents, adapted to wildly different environments, and established dominance over other species. We know that agriculture emerged independently in multiple regions. We know that civilization did not appear in a vacuum. When this evidence is placed next to the biblical narrative, something curious happens. The conflict is not as direct as many assume. In fact, certain details begin to align in unexpected ways. Genesis describes a world before Adam that lacks cultivated plants and organized agriculture. It describes environmental conditions that resemble what climate science tells us about the Near East after major climatic shifts. It describes Adam as a figure introduced into an already existing world, tasked with a specific role rather than embodying the entirety of humanity. This raises a question that feels almost taboo to ask. What if Adam was not the first human, but the first of something else? In the Sumerian texts, a name appears that is difficult to ignore. Adamu, phonetically similar, temporally older. In those tablets, Adamu is not described as the first man to walk the earth. He is described as a ruler, a king, a foundational figure in a political lineage. The earliest recorded use of the name Adam appears not in the Bible, but in these ancient Mesopotamian records. That alone does not prove a connection, but it does suggest a lineage of ideas traveling through time, shifting meaning as they go. If Adamu was remembered as a first king, and if that memory passed through cultures and centuries, it is not hard to imagine how the title could eventually become a symbol. A king becomes an ancestor becomes the first man. Over thousands of years, nuance collapses into simplicity, and simplicity is powerful. This reframing resolves several long-standing puzzles. Cain's fear of encountering other people after killing Abel, the existence of cities when Adam's descendants should have been few, the sudden appearance of complex societies without a clear developmental record in Scripture. If humans already existed, these details stop being contradictions. They become background. Adam, then, could represent a threshold. Not the beginning of humanity, but the beginning of a particular lineage. A lineage marked by law, agriculture, and long lifespans. A lineage set apart from others. This interpretation does not require rejecting the text. It requires reading it without assumptions that were never written into it in the first place. And this is where the Sumerian tablets quietly re-enter the conversation. Because in those texts, humanity is not born fully formed. It is shaped, modified, organized, taught by beings who already possess knowledge. The story is not one of spontaneous emergence, but of intervention. When these narratives are placed side by side, the similarities are unsettling. Different cultures, different gods, different languages. Yet the same structural idea repeats. Humans appear, then something changes, then civilization begins. Adam may not be the first man. He may be the first recorded outcome of a process that began long before him. And if that is true, then the question is no longer about theology versus science. It is about memory. About how ancient people understood transitions they could not fully explain. And about how those explanations survived, embedded in texts, waiting for a time when they could be compared rather than isolated. Because once the idea of first man dissolves, something far more disturbing takes its place. If Adam was introduced into a world that already contained humans, then someone, or something, decided when and how that introduction would happen. And the tablets have not finished telling us why. Once the idea of a first man begins to soften, another question takes its place almost immediately. If Adam was not the beginning, then what exactly was he the beginning of? This is where the name itself becomes impossible to ignore. In the Sumerian and Akkadian texts, Adamu does not appear as a mythical cipher or symbolic stand-in for humanity. He appears in lists, in sequences, in records that care very much about order. Adamu is not floating in a timeless garden. He is anchored in chronology, and that alone changes how we should read the name. Names in the ancient world were not casual labels. They carried function, identity, status. To be named in a tablet was to be counted as part of an administrative reality. When scribes recorded kings, they were not telling stories. They were maintaining continuity. Authority depended on lineage, and lineage depended on memory. Adamu's appearance in these texts suggests not an origin of flesh, but an origin of rule. If he was remembered as a king, that would explain why later traditions elevated him. Kings are natural candidates for mythic inflation. They sit at the intersection of human and divine authority. Over time, their stories stretch, their reigns lengthen, their actions acquire cosmic significance. This process is not hypothetical. We can watch it happen in other cultures. Roman emperors became gods. Legendary founders became children of heaven. History did not disappear. It transformed. So, imagine a figure remembered as the first ruler of a new order, a reorganizer, someone who presided over a transition, over generations. That memory could detach from politics and reattach to cosmology. The first king becomes the first man. Not because the texts say so, but because later readers need a simpler origin. And simplicity always wins when records are sparse. This interpretation also aligns uncomfortably well with the way ancient texts describe the shift into civilization. There is rarely a sense of gradual learning. Instead, knowledge arrives. Agriculture, law, writing, astronomy, they appear abruptly, as if imported, rather than invented. The Sumerians did not claim to discover these things through trial and error. They claimed they were taught, given, delivered by beings who already understood how the world worked. The role of humanity, at least at first, was not to innovate, but to implement. If Adamu stood at the beginning of that implementation, then his importance makes sense. He would not be the first biological human. He would be the first human placed into a system. Now systems leave records. This perspective also reframes the obsession with long lifespans in early texts. Extraordinary longevity may not describe biology as we understand it today. It may describe continuity of office, dynastic memory compressed into individual reigns. Or it may reflect a distinction between groups, those who belonged to an older order and those who did not. Either way, the obsession itself is telling. Ancient scribes cared deeply about time. They measured it, recorded it, and used it to legitimize authority. Long reigns were not decorative. They were explanatory. They justified why certain figures mattered more than others. which brings us back to the broader pattern emerging from the tablets. Civilization is never presented as a human accident. It is presented as a transfer. Something passes from one group to another. From gods to kings. From kings to people. From teachers to workers. Once you see that pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee it. It appears in origin stories and law codes, in myths that refuse to stay purely symbolic. And crucially, it appears across cultures that had no reason to agree on theology. That consistency does not prove intervention, but it does undermine the idea of spontaneous emergence. At minimum, it suggests that ancient civilizations believed themselves to be inheritors, not pioneers. They did not see history as a straight line beginning with them. They saw it as a continuation of something older, something already established. And this is where modern discomfort enters the frame. If Adamu was not the first man, but the first designated man, the first king, the first organizer, the first of a modified lineage, then humanity's story becomes less about origin and more about selection. Someone chose when civilization would begin. Someone decided who would lead it. Someone defined the rules that would govern it. The tablets do not explain who that someone was in terms we find acceptable today. They speak in the language available to them. Gods, heavens, decrees descending from above. We translate those terms into metaphor to protect ourselves from their implications. But translation does not erase intent. If Adamu stands at the threshold between an unrecorded past and a meticulously documented future, then his role is not to answer our questions. His role is to mark the moment when something changed. And if that change was guided rather than accidental, then the question is no longer, where did we come from? It becomes, why were we reorganized? Because whatever stood on the other side of that threshold did not vanish. It simply stopped writing. Long before names like Adamu were pressed into clay, long before kingship was said to descend from heaven, something else was already happening on this planet. Something quieter, older, and far more difficult to reconcile with the idea that modern humans were always the central characters in Earth's story. In the sun-bleached landscapes of East Africa, archaeologists uncovered stone tools that should not exist, at least not according to the timeline most of us grew up with. These tools were not rough accidents. They were intentionally shaped stone flakes, designed to cut, scrape, and process food. They belonged to what researchers now call the Old Awan Toolkit, and they date back roughly 3 million years. 3 million years. That number alone forces a pause. Homo sapiens, as we define ourselves today, would not appear for a very long time after that. Even our closest ancestors were still evolving, still experimenting with posture, with diet, with survival strategies. And yet, here were tools, technology, evidence of planning, evidence of foresight. The creators of these tools were not human. They belonged to another group of upright walking hominins, known as Paranthropus. For decades, Paranthropus was treated as a biological dead end. Large jaws, thick skulls, enormous molar teeth, small brains. They were imagined as strong but simple, capable of survival, but not of innovation. That assumption did not survive contact with the stones. These tools were not random. They were consistent. They followed recognizable patterns. They were sharp enough to butcher animals, slice plants, and extract marrow from bones. Nearby researchers found hippo remains bearing clean-cut marks, not bite marks. Not damage from scavengers, but precise incisions made by stone tools. This was not opportunistic scavenging. This was deliberate processing. Someone knew what they were doing. This discovery quietly dismantled a comforting narrative. Humans did not invent tools as the first thinking species on Earth. Tool use did not begin with us. It was inherited, or at least, preceded. An inheritance implies interaction. If Paranthropus developed tool technology and then disappeared, the question is not simply where they went. The more unsettling question is how Homo sapiens later appeared with similar technological instincts, but without a clear independent origin for them. Evolution does not typically reinvent the same complex behavior from scratch. It modifies. It adapts. It copies what works. Which raises a disturbing possibility. What if early humans did not invent tool use, but learned it? What if technology passed between species, not peacefully, but through competition? What if Homo sapiens did not rise because they were the first to think, but because they were the ones who survived the transfer of knowledge? The archaeological record offers no neat answers. Paranthropus left behind, no cities, no writing, no monuments. Wood decays, fiber vanishes. Only stone remains. And stone tells us just enough to know that something important happened, and not enough to explain how. Some researchers speculate that Paranthropus may have built temporary shelters, used perishable materials, or organized in ways that left no trace after millions of years. It is not impossible. Entire human cultures have vanished within a few thousand years, leaving almost nothing behind. 3 million years is an eternity. So we are left with tools without a voice. And this is where the story loops back to the tablets. Because when the Sumerians wrote about a time before humans were organized, they did not describe chaos. They described labor, work already being done, but done inefficiently. Gods who were tired, gods who needed relief. The solution was not to invent intelligence, but to reassign it. In that framing, humanity is not the beginning of technology. Humanity is the optimization of it. A workforce designed to take over tasks already understood. This is speculative, of course. But speculation is exactly where the evidence pushes us. We have intelligent behavior before humans. We have sudden leaps in organization after long periods of biological stagnation. And we have ancient texts insisting that knowledge was transferred, not discovered. The uncomfortable thread running through all of this is displacement. Paranthropus disappears. Homo sapiens thrives. Tools remain. Knowledge persists. The original innovators vanish, while the inheritors write history. If that sounds uncomfortably familiar, it should. There's a pattern humans themselves have repeated endlessly. We absorb technology, we outcompete rivals, we erase predecessors, and we tell stories that place ourselves at the center of progress. But the stones do not tell stories. They only show use. And when those stones predate us by millions of years, they whisper a truth we rarely like to face. Intelligence on this planet did not wait for us to arrive, which means that when ancient texts speak of beings who taught, organized, and ruled before humanity's rise, they may not be inventing a fantasy. They may be preserving a memory of succession, not gods descending from the sky, but something older stepping aside or being pushed aside. And if humanity inherited the earth rather than earning it, then the question is no longer whether we are special. It is whether we are the latest chapter in a story that began long before we learned how to read it. Once the idea of secession enters the frame, the story takes on a very different tone. It stops being a heroic tale of human ascent and starts to resemble something far less flattering. A story not of discovery, but of inheritance. Not of origin, but of arrival. If tools existed before us, if organized labor existed before us, if knowledge was already present in the world before we began writing it down, then humanity's defining trait may not be intelligence in the way we like to imagine it. It may be adaptability, opportunism, the ability to absorb, repurpose, and scale what already works. That alone would be unsettling. But the implications deepen when we turn the lens back on ourselves. Modern humans are, in many ways, biologically strange. We walk upright, yet our spines struggle under the weight. We are nearly hairless, yet vulnerable to sunlight. We have large brains, yet difficult births that endanger both mother and child. We are omnivores who cannot safely eat much of what nature offers without processing it first. Compared to most animals, we arrive in the world helpless and remain dependent for years. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, this is an odd design. Other species seem perfectly tuned to their environments. A foal stands within minutes. Birds build nests without instruction. Predators are born with instincts that work immediately. Humans, by contrast, require culture to survive. Without tools, without knowledge passed down, without social systems, we collapse quickly. And yet, despite all of these disadvantages, we became the dominant species on the planet in an astonishingly short amount of time. In roughly 5,000 years, we went from scratching symbols into clay to splitting atoms. From stone tools to satellites. No other species has demonstrated anything remotely comparable. Evolution, as a slow and incremental process, struggles to account for that acceleration. This is where some researchers begin to entertain ideas that feel dangerous to say out loud. What if modern humans are not native to the ecological conditions of Earth? What if our physiology reflects adaptation to a different environment, lower gravity, weaker sunlight, or a world where certain stresses did not exist? What if our intelligence did not evolve neatly alongside our bodies, but was introduced, altered, or accelerated? These questions are not confined to ancient texts. They appear in modern scientific debate as well, though often on the fringes. Some have suggested that humanity's rapid cognitive leap represents a form of intervention, not a sudden creation, but a modification, a push. The Sumerian tablets describe something remarkably similar. They speak of beings who altered humans to make them suitable for work, not by inventing life from nothing, but by reshaping what already existed. Mixing, refining, adjusting. Again, this does not have to mean extraterrestrials in the way popular culture imagines them. It could describe a forgotten hominin lineage, a technologically superior group that no longer exists, or even a symbolic memory of a biological process that ancient people could not fully understand. But symbolism does not erase the structure of the claim. Humans are described as designed to fill a role, and when that idea is placed next to our real-world dependence on tools, culture, and learned behavior, it becomes difficult to dismiss entirely. We are not strong. We are not fast. We are not resilient in isolation. What we are is clever in systems. We survive by outsourcing our weaknesses to technology. Perhaps that has always been the point. If humanity is the inheritor of earlier intelligence, whether biological, cultural, or something else entirely, then our sudden rise makes sense. We did not start from zero. We started mid-sentence, picking up tools, ideas, and structures that already existed, and pushing them further than their original creators ever could. And that may explain something else the ancient texts hint at repeatedly. A sense of loss. The gods grow tired. The old order ends. Something withdraws. The world is handed over. Civilization begins. These stories are not triumphant. They are transitional. They speak of an age ending so that another can begin. In that light, humanity is not the first intelligent presence on Earth. It is the one that remained. And if we are honest, that realization reframes our place in the universe. It suggests that our greatest achievement was not creation, but continuation, not invention, but amplification. Which leaves one final question hanging, unanswered. If we were shaped to inherit the Earth, then what were we inheriting it from? And more importantly, where did they go? At the end of all this motion after the tablets, the tools, the names that blur between king and ancestor, the story does not conclude with a revelation. It slows, it settles, it exhales. Because the most honest ending is not an answer, but a silence that feels different than before. Somewhere, in museum drawers and underground archives, the remaining tablets still rest. Most of them have not been read. Most of them have not even been scanned. They are patient in a way humans are not. Clay does not rush. It does not argue. It does not need to convince anyone of anything. It simply waits. And waiting, it turns out, is powerful. The emergence of artificial intelligence does not mean the past will suddenly become clear. It means the past will become loud. Patterns will surface. Contradictions will multiply. Stories we assumed were symbolic may begin to look procedural. Records we dismissed as myth may reveal administrative logic. And texts we thought we understood may quietly shift their meaning when surrounded by thousands of others saying similar things. This is not the collapse of history. It is the expansion of it. For a long time, humanity has told itself a simple story. We stood up. We thought harder. We invented tools. We invented civilization. We invented ourselves. It is a story that feels good. It places us at the center. It makes progress feel inevitable. But the deeper we look, the more that story begins to feel like a summary rather than a transcript. The ancient writers did not describe themselves as pioneers. They described themselves as recipients. Knowledge came from somewhere. Order was established, not discovered. Kingship descended. Civilization arrived, fully formed, already knowing how to function. And perhaps that was simply the only language they had to describe processes that unfolded over timescales they could not measure. Or perhaps they were recording something very literal, very practical, and very inconvenient for modern pride. What if humanity's role was never to be first? What if our role was to be next? There is something strangely calming in that idea. It removes the pressure of expeditioism. It replaces it with responsibility. If we inherited this world, its tools, its knowledge, its unfinished systems, then what matters is not where we came from, but what we do with what we were given. The fear that often follows these questions comes from imagining ourselves as small, manipulated, or insignificant. But inheritance does not imply weakness. It implies trust. Someone, or something, believed that humanity could carry the story forward. And so far, we took symbols pressed into clay and turned them into languages that circled the planet in milliseconds. We took stone tools and turned them into instruments that can peer into the deepest parts of the universe. We took borrowed ideas and made them our own. That does not erase the mystery of what came before. It deepens it. Because mysteries are not threats. They are invitations. The clay tablets are not accusing us of misunderstanding our past. They are offering us a chance to read it more carefully. To slow down. To notice patterns instead of slogans. To sit with uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. And perhaps that is the real gift of this moment. Not the idea that history will be rewritten overnight, but the realization that history was never finished in the first place. Somewhere between the gods of the tablets and the algorithms of today, between the first tools and the last questions, there is a continuity we are only beginning to see. So if you feel unsettled, that is understandable. If you feel curious, that is even better. The story does not demand belief. It asks for attention. The clay is speaking again, not to tell us who we are, but to remind us that we are still becoming.